In the cold breath of January 1946, the hills of Pasadena concealed more than just the steady hum of post-war optimism. California had become a place where the future was being forged. Aerospace labs hummed with innovation, universities buzzed with the talk of atomic energy, and suburban neighborhoods sprouted in neat rows under the Californian sun. Yet behind the white picket fences and the bold rhetoric of a victorious America, there pulsed a far stranger rhythm, a rhythm of whispered incantations, of secret rites conducted behind closed doors, of candles burning in the night as shadows stretched across desert sands. And at the center of this convergence of science and sorcery was one man, Jack Parsons. To his peers, he was a genius in propulsion, a visionary whose experiments with volatile fuels helped ignite the dawn of space exploration. To his followers, he was a priest of forbidden knowledge, a man daring enough to call upon entities that most people would never even dare name. Parsons lived in a paradox, standing with one foot in the halls of scientific progress and the other firmly planted in the abyss. The opening image is almost cinematic, a mansion on Orange Grove Avenue in Pasadena, outwardly ordinary, its wide porch draped with the calm of a California evening. Yet within, as the neighbors slept, something dark unfolded. Parsons and his circle, an eclectic collection of bohemians, actors, magicians, and outcasts, were engaged in ceremonies that blended the erotic with the esoteric, rituals meant to tear open the veil between the seen and the unseen. They invoked the names of gods and demons while the echoes of World War II still lingered in the air, as if the apocalypse had not ended but only shifted its stage. To understand why a rocket scientist would turn to sorcery is to descend into the twisted heart of the 20th century itself, a century that promised progress but delivered nightmares, a century in which the search for knowledge often led to unholy ground. Jack Parsons was not a man content with the ordinary. From the time he was a boy, he dreamed of conquering the heavens, of building machines that could break the chains of Earth's gravity. But those dreams were not divorced from his darker fascinations. He read forbidden texts, devoured occult literature, and grew obsessed with the writings of Aleister Crowley, the self-styled Great Beast. Parsons' hunger was never just for rockets or rituals, but for transcendence, a way to crack open reality itself and step into realms beyond human comprehension. His life, therefore, becomes a cautionary tale of ambition without boundaries, of brilliance tethered to obsession. The line between exploration and damnation is perilously thin, and Parsons walked it with reckless pride. California in 1946 provided fertile ground for such contradictions. On one hand, the state embodied the American dream, sprawling suburbs, Hollywood glamour, and laboratories filled with restless innovation. On the other, it was a place of shadows, where spiritualism, mysticism, and secret societies thrived under the surface. Parsons Lodge was not merely a house, it was a crucible where these opposing currents collided. For outsiders, it was rumored to be a den of sin, a place of orgies, black magic, and whispered blasphemies. For insiders, it was a temple where the veil of reality could be pierced and new gods, or monsters, might answer. The neighbors may have dismissed it as a house of eccentrics, but those who entered its halls knew they were stepping into a realm where science and sorcery were bound in a pact. The paradox deepens when we consider what was at stake. The same man who conducted midnight rituals under the stars was also working on technologies that would help launch humanity into space. He mixed rocket fuel by day and invoked ancient deities by night. This dissonance is at the core of the story, a man building the future while simultaneously trying to resurrect the past, or perhaps something that should never be awakened. Parsons' world was filled with contradictions that could not be reconciled, yet he thrived in them, feeding on the chaos as if it was fuel itself. It is this duality that makes him such a compelling and terrifying figure. He was not simply a scientist dabbling in mysticism, nor merely an occultist with a scientific hobby. He was both, fully and completely, a fusion of intellect and darkness that remains almost unparalleled in history. What makes his story more chilling is the way it reflects the age in which he lived. The mid-20th century was an era of great upheaval, where old certainties crumbled and new powers arose. Atomic bombs had redefined human capability and terror. Rockets promised to carry man beyond the sky, but also threatened to rain fire from above. The occult, long dismissed as superstition, found new life among intellectuals and seekers disillusioned by war and materialism. Parsons stood at the nexus of these forces, embodying both the hope and the dread of an age that had cracked open Pandora's box. To tell his story is not merely to recount the biography of one eccentric man, but to peel back the layers of a culture grappling with forces too vast, too terrifying, and too seductive to control. As the ceremonies of 1946 began, the line between science and sorcery blurred beyond recognition. Parsons believed he was on the brink of summoning something monumental, a force or entity that could change the world. His followers whispered of Babylon, of scarlet women, of powers that burned hotter than rocket flames. These were not the idle fantasies of a lunatic fringe, but the deliberate actions of a man whose intelligence could not be denied, whose charisma drew others into his orbit, and whose rituals carried a weight that still lingers in the shadows of history. To step into this world is to step into a hellish paradox, where the genius that helped reach the stars also sought to tear open the gates of hell. And so, we begin. This is not simply the story of a man, nor merely of a lodge, but of a moment when humanity flirted with the forbidden. It is a descent into the California of 1946, into the house where science met sorcery, and into the heart of Jack Parsons, the rocket scientist who dared to summon the abyss. His ceremonies were not just performances, they were attempts to rewrite reality itself. Whether he succeeded, or whether he was destroyed by the very forces he unleashed, remains the haunting question that echoes through time. The California of 1946 was a place vibrating with contradictions, a landscape where the bright glow of modern progress collided with shadows that most Americans never noticed, or pretended not to see. The Second World War had ended only months before, leaving behind both relief and unease. Soldiers were returning home in droves, bringing stories of firestorms, atomic blasts, and horrors that could not be easily forgotten. Cities swelled with new life, families planted roots in suburban developments, and the American dream seemed more tangible than ever before. Yet beneath this sheen of normalcy, the soil of California nurtured something stranger. It was a place where secrets flourished, where isolation and desert emptiness gave room for minds to wander, and where seekers of the forbidden found both anonymity and freedom. Into this peculiar climate stepped Jack Parsons and his occult lodge, planting themselves at the exact crossroads of science and sorcery. Post-war California was a state of immense growth, powered by aerospace contracts, defense industries, and the influx of veterans who now trained under the GI Bill. Laboratories that had once built weapons for war turned their attention to the possibilities of space, rocketry, and the atomic age. Pasadena, where Parsons lived, was home to the California Institute of Technology, better known as Caltech, a hub of cutting-edge research. Engineers and scientists flocked to the region, transforming it into a crucible of invention. But this focus on science and technology was paralleled by a rising fascination with mysticism, astrology, and fringe spirituality. Hollywood stars flirted with seances, fortune-tellers advertised in newspapers, and self-styled prophets gathered followers in the canyons of Los Angeles. The war had left people hungry for meaning, searching for something beyond the cold mathematics of bombs and rockets. California, with its sprawling openness, became a spiritual frontier as much as a technological one. The contrast was especially sharp in Pasadena, a city where old wealth and respectability coexisted uneasily with bohemian enclaves. Along Orange Grove Avenue, often called Millionaire's Row, stood imposing mansions that had once belonged to the elite. By the mid-1940s, however, many of these homes had fallen into disrepair, or been rented out to those who could not afford the luxury they represented. It was in one of these grand but fading houses that Parsons established his lodge. Outwardly, the building seemed like any other: wide porches, manicured lawns, tall palms swaying in the desert wind. Neighbors may have wondered at the odd assortment of young men and women coming and going at all hours, but most looked the other way. In reality, the house had become a theater of the forbidden, a place where rituals unfolded in secret, cloaked by the veneer of suburban respectability. The cultural backdrop of California also shaped the lodge's peculiar magnetism. This was a state built on reinvention, a place where fortunes were made overnight and identities could be remade as easily as film scripts. In Los Angeles especially, the air carried the scent of performance, of masks, roles, and fantasies come alive. Parsons' Lodge tapped into this spirit, offering an escape from conventional life. For struggling actors, frustrated intellectuals, and adventurous seekers, it promised something both dangerous and alluring: the chance to participate in forbidden knowledge. Within its walls, the social hierarchies of post-war America could be suspended. The rituals gave permission to break rules, to dissolve the boundaries of sexuality, morality, and even sanity itself. The California dream became the California nightmare, hidden in plain sight. But California was also a land of contradictions in its very geography. To the west lay the ocean, endless and inviting. To the east stretched the Mojave Desert, a place of silence, heat, and vast emptiness. The desert especially held a strange allure for seekers of mystery. It was a place that seemed unearthly, barren yet alive, capable of stirring visions in those who gaze too long into its endless horizon. Parsons and his followers often used the desert as a ritual ground, its isolation granting them both privacy and an otherworldly stage for their ceremonies. The same desert that hosted secret government tests of rockets and bombs also became the site of invocations to gods, demons, and elemental forces. In no other place could such opposites coexist so naturally. California, it seemed, was always a land of extremes, the birthplace of dreams and the graveyard of illusions. This atmosphere of secrecy and possibility was intensified by the paranoia of the time. The Cold War was beginning to take shape, and whispers of espionage, betrayal, and infiltration filled the newspapers. The government kept a close eye on anyone who strayed from the narrow path of patriotism, especially intellectuals and freethinkers. The very qualities that made California a breeding ground for experimentation, its openness, its eccentricity, its tolerance for outsiders, also made it a place of suspicion. For Parsons and his lodge, this meant their ceremonies were conducted under the constant threat of exposure, a reminder that their experiments in sorcery were as dangerous politically as they were spiritually. The FBI and military intelligence would eventually take notice, but in 1946, the lodge still operated in the shadows, a secret flame burning in a city of illusions. At the same time, the cultural undercurrents of Los Angeles made the occult strangely acceptable, at least to certain circles. Magazines of the day featured articles on astrology and palm reading. Bookstores sold texts on theosophy, Eastern mysticism, and Crowley's teachings. Hollywood itself flirted with the dark and exotic, producing films about devil worship, mad scientists, and supernatural forces lurking beneath the surface of polite society. In such an environment, Parsons' Lodge did not seem entirely out of place. It was extreme, certainly, but it drew upon the very currents that were already flowing through California's veins. The difference was that while others merely played at darkness, Parsons and his inner circle believed they could wield it. Thus, the California of 1946 must be understood as both context and catalyst. It was a place where science reached for the stars while shadows deepened in hidden rooms. It was a state where prosperity flourished while paranoia brewed. And it was the perfect stage for Parsons' hellish ceremonies, because only in such a land of contradictions could his dual identity as rocket scientist and occult priest exist without immediate collapse. California was not just the backdrop to his story, it was the co-conspirator, the environment that made his terrifying experiments possible. To understand the rituals of the Pasadena Lodge, we must first understand the strange alchemy of the time and place in which they took root, an alchemy that blended optimism with dread, progress with superstition, and ambition with the ever-present whisper of damnation. Jack Parsons was born as Marvel Whiteside Parsons in 1914, but even from the start his life was shaped by brokenness and longing. His father abandoned the family when he was still a boy, leaving Jack and his mother to navigate a world of privilege tinged with scandal. Growing up in Pasadena, Parsons was surrounded by wealth and opportunity, but he never fit neatly into its expectations. The absence of a stable father figure fueled his obsessions, pushing him to seek belonging in strange places, first in the laboratory of science, and later in the shadowy world of forbidden ritual. His childhood fascination with mythology and adventure stories soon gave way to more dangerous pursuits, explosives, chemistry, and the occult. Even as a teenager, Parsons displayed a remarkable ability to transform obsession into action. He wasn't simply a dreamer, he was someone who set fire to his dreams and watched them burn with him in the center. By his late teens, Parsons had already built homemade rockets and dabbled in dangerous chemical experiments, sometimes leaving scorched patches in his backyard or terrifying neighbors with unexpected explosions. What made him stand out was not only his recklessness but his brilliance. He had an instinct for chemistry that was almost supernatural, as if he could feel the volatile compounds whispering their secrets. While others relied on textbooks, Parsons relied on intuition. That gift would later help him revolutionize rocket fuel mixtures, creating compounds stable enough to power the machines that would one day take humans into space. Yet this same instinct also made him reckless, and the thrill of playing with fire, literally and figuratively, became an inseparable part of his identity. To be Jack Parsons was to live in constant proximity to destruction. His fascination with the occult emerged alongside his interest in rocketry, forming a strange duality that would define his life. As a teenager, Parsons began reading the works of H.P. Lovecraft and became enamored with the dark grandeur of forbidden knowledge. He also discovered the writings of Aleister Crowley, the British occultist who declared himself the Great Beast 666. Crowley's philosophy of Thelema, with its central maxim, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," struck Parsons like a thunderbolt. Here was a creed that sanctioned desire, indulgence, and the pursuit of hidden truths without restraint. For a young man haunted by abandonment and burning with ambition, Thelema offered not only a spiritual compass but a justification for his restless hunger. He began to see science and sorcery not as opposites but as parallel paths to transcendence, both capable of ripping through the limits imposed by ordinary life. During the 1930s, Parsons found his place in a group of young scientists and engineers at Caltech who were experimenting with rockets. They were nicknamed the Suicide Squad because of their reckless methods and frequent accidents. While academics dismissed rocketry as fantasy, Parsons and his colleagues insisted it could change the world. They experimented in dry riverbeds and desert canyons, blasting engines that often failed spectacularly. Parsons, though lacking formal training, provided the alchemical genius that transformed their ideas into tangible fuels and engines. His breakthroughs in solid and liquid propellants eventually contributed to the formation of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, a name now synonymous with NASA and space exploration. Parsons should have been remembered solely as a founding father of the space age, a visionary who turned science fiction into reality. But history remembers him differently, because while rockets carried him upward, the occult kept pulling him back into the abyss. His personal life became increasingly entwined with his occult pursuits. Parsons joined the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, the occult order led internationally by Aleister Crowley. In Los Angeles, Parsons quickly rose to prominence within the Agape Lodge, the OTO's local branch. His charisma, wealth, and unshakable confidence made him a natural leader. Members were drawn not only to his scientific prestige but also to the magnetic intensity with which he performed rituals. For Parsons, magic was not abstract, it was visceral, bloody, and passionate. He saw no contradiction between mixing rocket fuel in the lab and invoking ancient gods in the lodge. To him, both were experiments with power. Both were ways of tearing open the fabric of reality to reach something beyond human limitation. Where others saw superstition, he saw science waiting to be discovered. Where others saw danger, he saw opportunity. Yet this dual identity came at a cost. In the eyes of many colleagues, Parsons' interest in the occult discredited his scientific achievements. He was brilliant but unreliable, a man who seemed as likely to blow up his laboratory as he was to deliver a breakthrough. His personal life grew increasingly chaotic as well. The lodge became not just a spiritual order but a communal home filled with artists, bohemians, and seekers who embraced Crowley's doctrine of sexual freedom and magical experimentation. Parsons was at the center of it all, hosting ceremonies that blended orgiastic rites with serious invocations. He began to see himself not merely as a student of Crowley but as a prophet in his own right, destined to bring about the next great spiritual age. His writings reveal a man who believed he was chosen, that his destiny stretched far beyond the earth, into realms both cosmic and infernal. What made Parsons especially dangerous was the way his genius in science reinforced his belief in magic. Each successful rocket test, each explosion that defied gravity, seemed to confirm his sense that human will could reshape reality. He did not see magic and science as separate disciplines but as two expressions of the same principle, the manipulation of forces through knowledge and intent. This fusion gave him an aura of authenticity that few occultists possessed. He wasn't just chanting in candlelight, he was building machines that proved his visions could work. For his followers, this made him both inspiring and terrifying. Here was a man who not only claimed to summon spirits but also built engines that could shake the earth. Despite his achievements, Parsons was a man plagued by instability. He struggled with finances, often spending recklessly to fund both his experiments and his ceremonies. His relationships were volatile, frequently collapsing under the weight of jealousy, betrayal, and obsession. He longed for transcendence but was trapped by his own excesses. Friends describe him as brilliant yet self-destructive, a man who could inspire loyalty one moment and alienate with cruelty the next. His personality reflected the same duality as his pursuits, half visionary, half destroyer, always walking the edge between triumph and ruin. This instability would eventually contribute to his downfall, but in 1946, it only added to the aura of danger that surrounded him. By the time the infamous ceremonies of the mid-1940s began, Parsons was already a figure of legend in both scientific and occult circles. To the military and his colleagues at JPL, he was the eccentric genius who helped pioneer rocket propulsion. To the followers of Crowley, he was a rising star, a man bold enough to enact rituals that others only whispered about. To outsiders, he was a scandalous curiosity, a wealthy man who had turned his Pasadena mansion into a temple of sin. His life was a storm of contradictions, But it was precisely these contradictions that made him so magnetic. He was proof that brilliance could coexist with madness, that genius could walk hand in hand with damnation. Understanding Jack Parsons is essential to understanding the story of the Lodge. He was its leader, its prophet, its mad scientist, and its high priest. Without him, the house on Orange Grove Avenue would have been just another dilapidated mansion rented out to eccentric tenants. With him, it became a portal, a place where the ordinary rules of society and science were suspended, where the future of humanity was being shaped in ways both miraculous and monstrous. Parsons was not just another eccentric Californian dabbling in magic. He was a man who embodied the century's darkest paradox, the marriage of science and sorcery, of progress and perdition. His life was a ritual in itself, one that still burns in history's memory, a warning and a temptation that refuses to fade. The Pasadena Lodge was not just a house, it was a world unto itself. From the outside, it stood as a fading mansion on Orange Grove Avenue, part of what had once been called Millionaire's Row. Once, it had hosted society gatherings and genteel lives of wealth and leisure. But by the mid-1940s, the house had fallen into disrepair, its grandeur dulled by peeling paint and aging wood. It was here that Jack Parsons created his Agape Lodge, transforming a crumbling mansion into a living temple of ritual, sin, and unrestrained experimentation. Those who entered its doors often describe it as stepping into another dimension, a place where the normal boundaries of post-war America seemed to dissolve into chaos, ecstasy, and terror. This was not simply a boarding house for eccentrics, it was an engine of transgression, a crucible where minds and bodies were burned in pursuit of forbidden truths. Life inside the lodge defied every convention of the time. Where most of Pasadena clung to respectability, this house teemed with scandal. Parsons rented rooms to actors, poets, drifters, and seekers of all kinds. There were women who had run away from their marriages, young men disillusioned by the war, artists hungry for inspiration, and occultists drawn by whispers of power. What they found inside the lodge was intoxicating, a community where the rules of polite society no longer applied. Nudity was common, sex was ritualized, and drugs passed hands as freely as conversation. To many outsiders, the lodge was nothing more than a den of debauchery, but to Parsons and his circle, it was a temple of transformation. Every act of indulgence was framed as magical, every transgression as sacred, every night as an opportunity to tear down the old order and build something terrifyingly new. The rituals themselves added to the lodge's aura of menace. Rooms were draped in curtains to block out daylight, while candles burned at all hours, their smoke mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder and strange incenses. On walls, symbols were painted or pinned, sigils from Crowley's teachings, stars and circles meant to open doors into other realms. At night, the house filled with chanting. Parsons, his booming voice commanding the room, would call upon gods, demons, and elemental forces. Participants, often under the influence of intoxicants, would dance, writhe, or collapse in ecstasy. Sexual rites were central, performed not as private acts but as deliberate ceremonies of magic. To Crowley, sex was a sacrament. To Parsons, it was a tool for breaking through the veil of reality. The lodge became infamous for its orgiastic ceremonies, where flesh and spirit were bound together in an attempt to summon powers that lay beyond human reach. The environment of the lodge blurred the line between genius and madness. On one hand, it was a place of remarkable intellectual activity. Conversations about physics, literature, and art mixed freely with discussions of ritual magic and prophecy. Scientists and occultists debated side by side, each trying to push the boundaries of human knowledge in their own way. On the other hand, it was a place of paranoia and instability. Alliances formed and dissolved, lovers betrayed one another, and jealousies flared into violent arguments. What Parsons saw as liberation often descended into chaos. Yet it was precisely this chaos that made the lodge both magnetic and dangerous. For those who entered, the experience could be transformative or shattering. Neighbors noticed strange things. They whispered about loud chanting, about the half-naked figures glimpsed through curtained windows, about the women who came and went at odd hours. Rumors spread that the house was a black magic cult, a place where orgies and satanic rituals took place. Children were warned not to walk past it alone. Some reports suggested that animals disappeared in the area, fueling speculation about sacrifices. While not every rumor was true, they reflected the aura of dread the lodge projected into its community. Pasadena, with its manicured lawns and suburban pride, had within its heart a mansion that pulsed like a dark wound, leaking whispers of hell into the quiet streets. Inside, Parsons presided as both scientist and priest. He was the gravitational center around which the lodge orbited. His charisma was undeniable. Followers describe him as simultaneously brilliant, terrifying, and irresistible. He commanded rituals with authority, blending Crowley's teachings with his own improvisations. To some, he was a visionary, someone willing to risk everything to pierce the veil of existence. To others, he was reckless, leading his followers toward madness. His leadership was not without challenges, and rivalries sometimes threatened to tear the lodge apart. Yet again and again, Parsons' intensity held the group together, his conviction forging unity from chaos, at least temporarily. His house was a magnet for seekers because he embodied both the promise and the peril of the forbidden. The physical atmosphere of the lodge reinforced its strangeness. Visitors described rooms cluttered with scientific equipment alongside ritual objects. Beakers and burners sat next to chalices and daggers. Rocket blueprints lay scattered near occult manuscripts. The boundaries between laboratory and temple, between rational experiment and irrational invocation, had dissolved entirely. This fusion of science and magic was no accident. It was Parsons' vision. He believed that progress required both, the precision of chemistry and the ecstasy of ritual, the mathematics of propulsion and the intoxication of the sacred. The lodge itself became the embodiment of that vision, a place where contradictions coexisted in uneasy harmony, waiting to explode. Yet beneath the freedom and ecstasy lay darker currents. Accounts from those who passed through the lodge speak of breakdowns, of people driven to the edge of sanity, of rituals that left participants hollow and shaken. The very intensity that made the lodge attractive also made it destructive. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was ruin. Parsons did not seem to care. He believed destruction was part of creation, that collapse was a necessary prelude to transformation. To him, the lodge was not a safe haven but a crucible, burning away weakness until only the strong, or the chosen, remained. Whether those chosen were elevated or damned was another question entirely. By 1946, the Pasadena Lodge had become infamous in both occult and scientific circles. For Crowley, it was both a triumph and a concern, proof that his teachings had taken root in America, but also a chaotic experiment spiraling beyond his control. For the scientific community, it was an embarrassment, evidence that one of their brightest minds was consorting with lunatics and degenerates. For the neighbors, it was a source of dread. And for Parsons himself, it was everything: his home, his temple, his stage, his experiment. In that house, science and sorcery fused into something terrifying, something that promised transcendence but carried the stench of damnation. The lodge was more than walls and rituals. It was a living organism, fed by desire, obsession, and ambition. It thrived on secrecy and scandal, on the electricity of minds and bodies pushed beyond their limits. It was both sanctuary and trap, both portal and prison. To step inside was to step into a world where the ordinary rules no longer applied. It was here that Parsons prepared for his most infamous ceremonies, rituals that would attempt to summon a goddess and alter the destiny of humanity itself. The lodge was the crucible. The fire that would burn within it was about to ignite. Aleister Crowley's shadow loomed over every corner of the Pasadena Lodge. Though the man himself was thousands of miles away in England, his presence was palpable in the words, symbols, and rituals that governed the lives of Jack Parsons and his followers. To understand the lodge, one must first understand Crowley, the prophet of darkness, the great beast 666, the man who fashioned himself as the living embodiment of rebellion against all moral and religious restraint. By 1946, Crowley was nearing the end of his life, ravaged by illness and addiction, but his teachings had already spread across continents, finding fertile ground in America's restless post-war landscape. Parsons was among his most devoted disciples, though their relationship was far from simple. For Parsons, Crowley was a guiding star, a source of inspiration and authority. For Crowley, Parsons was at once a promising magician and a reckless experimenter, someone to be both cultivated and mocked. Crowley's philosophy, Thelema, was founded on a radical principle: do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. This was not a call to hedonistic chaos, as some critics claimed, but a declaration that true spiritual freedom came from discovering and pursuing one's true will, a higher purpose that transcended morality, law, and convention. In practice, however, Crowley's followers often interpreted this doctrine as permission to indulge in whatever desires they wished. Ritual sex, drug use, and blasphemous ceremonies became common within his circles. To Parsons, this message was electric. Having grown up constrained by social expectations and haunted by personal abandonment, Crowley's words gave him not just permission but encouragement to embrace every hunger, every obsession. It was as if Crowley's philosophy had been written specifically for him. The Pasadena Lodge operated under Crowley's direct authority, though the physical distance between California and England meant much of this control was exercised through letters. Parsons corresponded with Crowley frequently, sending reports of rituals, lodge finances, and his own personal progress. In return, Crowley offered guidance, praise, and scathing criticism. These letters reveal a complex dynamic. Crowley alternated between admiration for Parsons' energy and disdain for what he saw as naivety. He sometimes called Parsons my son, but just as often referred to him as a fool, warning him not to let his passions cloud his judgment. Crowley was especially suspicious of Parsons' partnership with the charismatic young science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard, whom he believed to be manipulative. Suspect trickery, Crowley wrote, calling Hubbard a con man. Parsons ignored the warning. His devotion to Crowley was real, but he was not above believing he could surpass the master. Crowley's influence on the lodge extended beyond words. His rituals, writings, and imagery filled its rooms. Members studied the Book of the Law, Crowley's central text, which he claimed had been dictated to him by a supernatural being named Iwas. They enacted versions of Crowley's Gnostic Mass, a blasphemous parody of Catholic ritual that included sexual symbolism and the invocation of pagan deities. The symbols Crowley developed, such as the unicursal hexagram and the Eye of Horus, adorned the lodge. Even the structure of the lodge's communal life mirrored Crowley's vision of magical orders, a mixture of hierarchy, secrecy, and indulgence. Parsons, as head of the Agape Lodge, was the embodiment of Crowley's ideal: wealthy, intelligent, charismatic, unafraid of scandal, and willing to throw himself into magical experiments without hesitation. Yet Crowley himself was far from impressed with everything he heard. By the 1940s, he had spent decades cultivating his reputation as the world's most notorious occultist. He relished being called the wickedest man in the world by the press. But for Crowley, notoriety was never the point. It was power, transformation, and the pursuit of his Aeon of Horus, the new age he believed had dawned with the reception of the Book of the Law in 1904. When he read Parsons' letters describing the wild atmosphere of the Pasadena Lodge, its drug use, sexual excess, and frequent chaos, he often shook his head. He dismissed the house as a house of amateurs, complaining that they misunderstood his teachings. While he admired Parsons' energy, he considered him dangerously undisciplined. Still, he recognized in Parsons a potential heir, someone who might keep the flame of Thelema burning in the United States. The tension between Crowley's mentorship and criticism reveals something essential about both men. Crowley thrived on control, on bending others to his will, but he also delighted in watching his students push beyond convention. Parsons, meanwhile, craved both guidance and independence. He revered Crowley as a prophet but secretly longed to outshine him, to take Thelema into territories even Crowley had not dared. Parsons' willingness to fuse Thelema with science, to treat rocketry and ritual as parallel pursuits, was something Crowley never fully understood. Crowley saw magic as supreme, while Parsons sought to merge it with the empirical. This difference would eventually create distance between them, but in 1946, the relationship remained one of influence and tension, of loyalty and quiet rebellion. Crowley's shadow also influenced the darker reputation of the lodge. The neighbors who whispered about satanic rites often invoked Crowley's name, associating Parsons' activities with the notorious British occultist. Newspapers had painted Crowley as a monster for decades, describing his rituals as devil worship and his philosophy as perversion. In reality, Crowley was far more complex, brilliant, manipulative, mystical, and deeply flawed. But his image as a dark prophet was undeniable, and Parsons willingly stepped into that shadow. He embraced the scandal, the whispers, the sense that he and his followers were living on the edge of damnation. For Parsons, this was not a burden but a badge of honor. To be condemned by the world meant he was on the right path, following in Crowley's footsteps. Crowley's doctrine of sex magic was especially central to the Pasadena Lodge. Crowley taught that sexual energy was the most powerful force in the universe, capable of breaking through spiritual barriers and summoning supernatural powers. Rituals often involved the use of sex acts as magical tools, consecrated with invocations and symbolic gestures. Parsons adopted this wholeheartedly, turning the lodge into a laboratory of sex magic experiments. For him, orgasm was not merely physical release but a gateway to cosmic transformation. Each ritual, no matter how scandalous, was framed as a step towards summoning divine or demonic forces. It was this interpretation of Crowley's teachings that would lead directly to the infamous Babylon working ceremonies, where Parsons sought to incarnate the goddess of the New Age. By 1946, Crowley's health was failing, and his influence was waning in Europe. Yet in America, through Parsons and the Lodge, his teachings found new vitality. It is one of the great ironies of history that while Crowley died in relative obscurity the following year, his ideas lived on through disciples like Parsons, who carried them into strange new forms. In Parsons' hands, Thelema became not just a mystical philosophy but a living practice, fused with the ambitions of modern science and the chaos of post-war California. Crowley may have dismissed Parsons as reckless, but he could not deny that his disciple embodied the very spirit of dangerous innovation he had always championed. The Pasadena Lodge, then, was not simply Parsons' creation, it was Crowley's American shadow. Every ritual, every scandal, every whispered rumor carried his fingerprints. Parsons may have been the high priest, but Crowley was the ghost haunting the temple, shaping its purpose and its doom. To understand the hellish ceremonies of 1946 is to see them not only as the work of Parsons but as the continuation of Crowley's dark vision, transplanted into the soil of California. The great beast himself may never have set foot in Pasadena, but his presence was felt in every candle flame, every invocation, every whispered vow of "do what thou wilt." The Babylon working rituals of 1946 remain among the most infamous and unsettling episodes in the history of modern occultism. They were not whispered fantasies or scattered rumors. They were deliberate, structured ceremonies conducted by Jack Parsons and his close associate, L. Ron Hubbard, with the explicit aim of summoning an elemental force, a living goddess who would embody the archetype of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman of Aleister Crowley's Thelemic philosophy. To the participants, these were not symbolic acts. They were operations of genuine magical intent, performed with the conviction that such forces could be made flesh. For Parsons, the working represented the culmination of his dual obsessions, science and sorcery. He was no longer content with rituals that evoked unseen powers. He wanted to bring the goddess into the world in physical form. To understand these ceremonies is to step into a realm where the rational mind falters, where scientific genius bent itself towards summoning the divine and the infernal at once. The background to the working reveals the convergence of dangerous personalities. By early 1946, Parsons had become deeply involved with L. Ron Hubbard, then a charismatic and ambitious science fiction writer. Hubbard, who had later found Scientology, was at that time a wanderer, drifting through literary circles and occult groups. Parsons believed Hubbard to be a natural magician, gifted with an intuitive grasp of ritual and energy. Hubbard's charm and imagination made him a powerful partner, though others, including Crowley himself, warned that he was manipulative and untrustworthy. Parsons ignored the warnings, convinced that Hubbard was essential to the operation. Together, they set out to perform a series of rituals designed to summon the elemental consort who would aid in the creation of a new age. The stakes, as they understood them, were cosmic. The Babylon working began in January 1946 and stretched over weeks of ritual activity. The operations were based in part on Crowley's teachings but adapted by Parsons into a unique blend of ceremonial magic, sexual ritual, and visionary invocation. Each night, they prepared the space carefully. Candles burned on altars adorned with sigils and occult texts. Incense filled the room, thickening the air with a sense of unreality. Parsons donned ritual robes, while Hubbard often served as scribe or medium, recording visions and impressions that arose during the ceremonies. The air would vibrate with chanting, invocations of Babylon, of spirits of the air, of entities meant to bridge the gap between the material and the astral. Parsons, with his booming voice and fervent gestures, directed the energy, while Hubbard entered trances, claiming to perceive the forces they were summoning. Central to the working was the invocation of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman, a figure in Thelemic belief who embodied liberation, passion, and the destruction of old moral orders. Parsons believed that through sexual magic he could draw her essence into the physical world. The rituals involved acts of sex consecrated as sacred, with Parsons invoking the goddess while Hubbard recorded his words. The orgasm, according to Crowley's doctrine, was the moment of greatest magical potency, a tearing open of reality that allowed the will to imprint itself on the cosmos. Parsons, convinced of his role as prophet, saw himself as the one chosen to bring forth the incarnation of Babylon, a new Eve for a new eon. Each ritual was charged with this purpose, each act of passion framed as an offering to the goddess. The accounts of the working reveal both intensity and instability. Hubbard described visions of spirits appearing in flames, of figures riding across the desert sky, of female forms beckoning from beyond the veil. Parsons, in turn, recorded his sense that forces were gathering, that doors were opening. The rituals escalated in fervor, night after night, with the participants exhausted, exhilarated, and increasingly convinced that something real was happening. On one occasion, Hubbard claimed to see a figure of a woman clothed in fire, standing at the threshold of the ritual chamber. To Parsons, this was confirmation that their work was succeeding. He wrote in his journals that the elemental was approaching, that the Scarlet Woman was preparing to enter the world. The Babylon working cannot be dismissed simply as fantasy or delusion. To those involved, the experiences were profoundly real, and the psychological intensity they generated cannot be underestimated. Rituals of this kind often produce altered states of consciousness, visions, and feelings of contact with otherworldly forces. For Parsons, already immersed in both scientific experimentation and mystical belief, the boundary between hallucination and reality dissolved. He did not doubt that the goddess was near. In fact, he began to believe that she would soon arrive in human form. This conviction reached its climax when, shortly after the rituals concluded, a woman named Marjorie Cameron entered his life. To Parsons, this was no coincidence. He was certain that she was the elemental they had summoned, the living embodiment of Babylon. The danger of the working lay not only in its occult dimensions but also in its psychological and social consequences. Parsons' obsession with the rituals alienated many around him. Some lodge members grew fearful, sensing that the ceremonies had unleashed forces beyond control. Crowley himself, reading Parsons' reports from England, wrote with alarm, calling the whole affair a reckless experiment. He criticized Parsons as a fool led astray by Hubbard, a confidence man who had no true magical discipline. But Parsons ignored the warnings. To him, the success of the working was undeniable. He saw in Cameron's arrival the proof that the goddess had answered his call. Whether by coincidence, synchronicity, or self-delusion, the timing was too precise for him to doubt. The rituals also reflected the broader currents of the time. In 1946, the world had just witnessed the atomic bomb, the ultimate act of human will imposed on nature. The boundary between science and destruction had been shattered. For Parsons, the Babylon working was a parallel act of magical will, a human attempt to impose desire on the cosmos itself. Just as scientists had split the atom to release unimaginable power, Parsons sought to split the veil of reality to release the archetype of the goddess. Both acts were born of the same impulse, the belief that humanity could transcend limits, that nothing was beyond reach if only one dared enough. But while the atomic age reshaped history, the Babylon working left behind a more ambiguous legacy, one steeped in whispers, shadows, and fear. Even now, the Babylon working is remembered with a mixture of awe and dread. For occultists, it stands as one of the most ambitious magical operations ever attempted in the modern era. For skeptics, it is a cautionary tale of obsession and self-deception. For historians, it is a moment when the line between science fiction, psychology, and ritual blurred into something almost mythic. And for Parsons, it was the turning point of his life, the moment when he believed he had touched the divine, when he had brought a goddess into the world, even if the cost would ultimately consume him. The working was not simply a set of ceremonies. It was the declaration of a man who refused to accept the boundaries of reality, who dared to believe he could summon heaven and hell into the California night. When the candles finally burned low, and the chants echoed into silence, Parsons and Hubbard believed they had succeeded. The Scarlet Woman was coming. The new age was at hand. The lodge, once merely a house of ritual, had become the birthplace of something larger, something terrifying, something that would haunt not only Parsons' life but the very mythos of American occult history. The Babylon working was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of his descent, a descent that promised glory but delivered ruin. Marjorie Cameron's arrival at the Pasadena Lodge seemed almost like the fulfillment of a prophecy. In the weeks following the Babylon working, Jack Parsons had become increasingly convinced that the Scarlet Woman, the elemental incarnation of Babylon he had invoked with such fervor, would soon appear in his life. His journals from that period are filled with anticipation, noting omens, dreams, and a sense of impending revelation. And then, as if on cue, she walked through the door. Marjorie Cameron, a fiery-haired woman with striking features and an aura of otherworldly intensity, seemed to Parsons nothing less than the embodiment of the goddess he had summoned. To him, her presence was not coincidence but destiny, the living proof that his magical operations had succeeded. Cameron's background added to her mystique. Born in Iowa in 1922, she had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, working as a photographic technician. Her time in the military had given her discipline and independence, but it had also left her restless. After the war, she drifted west, drawn to California's promise of reinvention. Friends describe her as mercurial, passionate, and volatile, with a beauty that could shift from radiant to severe in an instant. She was an artist, a free spirit, and someone who carried with her a deep fascination with mysticism and symbolism. To Parsons, these qualities were more than attractive. They were divine confirmations. When he met her in early 1946, he was certain she was the elemental he and Hubbard had conjured during their rituals. In his mind, Marjorie Cameron was not just a woman, she was Babylon herself. Their relationship began with an intensity that startled even those accustomed to the chaos of the lodge. Parsons was immediately consumed by her presence, writing in his journals with reverence and awe. He saw her fiery hair and piercing eyes as signs of her divine nature, describing her as the flame that would ignite the new age. Cameron, for her part, seemed intrigued by Parsons' blend of scientific genius and occult devotion. She allowed herself to be drawn into his world of rituals and visions, taking on the role he so desperately wanted her to fulfill. Whether she truly believed herself to be the incarnation of Babylon or simply played along with Parsons' obsession is difficult to determine. What is certain is that her presence deepened the intensity of the lodge and pushed Parsons further into his magical delusions. Life with Cameron was both ecstatic and volatile. Their relationship was marked by extremes of passion and conflict. They would spend nights in ritual, invoking deities, and performing acts of sex magic consecrated to Babylon. Parsons believed these ceremonies were not only personal but cosmic, part of a grand unfolding destiny. He saw himself and Cameron as central figures in the Aeon of Horus, the new age foretold by Crowley, in which old moralities would be swept away and human will would reign supreme. Cameron, too, experienced visions during this time. She spoke of otherworldly encounters, of strange lights and presences that seemed to confirm Parsons' belief in her divine role. Their rituals became performances of devotion, ecstasy, and obsession, blurring the line between spiritual practice and psychological unraveling. But their relationship was not simply a shared fantasy, it also reflected the instability of both partners. Parsons, already prone to paranoia and extremes, found in Cameron both his muse and his torment. Her volatile nature matched his own, creating a dynamic that could swing from bliss to fury in an instant. They quarreled fiercely, often over jealousy or perceived betrayals, only to reconcile with equally fierce passion. The lodge residents watched with a mixture of fascination and fear as the couple's intensity seemed to consume the entire household. Cameron's arrival had not only fulfilled Parsons' prophecy but also amplified the atmosphere of chaos within the lodge, turning it into an even more unpredictable crucible of desire and madness. Cameron herself was not simply a passive figure in Parsons' story. She was an artist of considerable talent, later becoming known for her surreal, visionary works that often depicted mystical and apocalyptic imagery. Her art reflected the same energies that infused her relationship with Parsons: fire, transformation, and transcendence. In later years, she would insist that her encounters with Parsons had awakened something in her, opening her to experiences beyond the ordinary. Whether she believed herself to have been literally conjured or simply destined to meet Parsons, she accepted the role of the Scarlet Woman with a mixture of conviction and defiance. She seemed to thrive on the sense of destiny that Parsons projected onto her, even as it pushed her deeper into a world of instability. The figure of Cameron also troubled outsiders, including Crowley. When he learned of Parsons' claim that the Babylon working had succeeded in summoning her, he scoffed. Crowley dismissed the entire episode as foolishness, mocking Parsons for believing that a flesh-and-blood woman could be the incarnation of a goddess. He saw in Cameron's arrival nothing more than coincidence, perhaps even manipulation. To Crowley, Parsons had lost control of his reason, allowing obsession to eclipse discipline. Yet for Parsons, Cameron was proof of everything. He ignored Crowley's doubts and instead threw himself deeper into the conviction that he and Cameron together would change the course of history. The arrival of Cameron also signaled a turning point in Parsons' life. Up to that point, his occult experiments had often been conducted with a sense of intellectual curiosity and reckless ambition. With Cameron, however, they became personal, intimate, and consuming. She was not simply a partner in ritual, she was the ritual itself, the embodiment of the forces Parsons sought to unleash. Their union was framed as alchemical, a fusion of opposites meant to produce transcendence. For Parsons, every moment with her was charged with cosmic significance. For Cameron, the relationship seemed to provide both inspiration and destruction, pushing her further into the realms of vision and instability that would mark her later life. In retrospect, Cameron's arrival can be seen as both the fulfillment of Parsons' greatest magical ambition and the beginning of his undoing. She gave him the sense of divine confirmation he craved, but she also deepened his descent into obsession and instability. Their relationship would later collapse under the weight of betrayal, paranoia, and tragedy. Yet in 1946, their union burned with a fevered intensity that seemed to promise the birth of a new world. Whether one sees it as coincidence, synchronicity, or supernatural intervention, the timing of Cameron's appearance in Parsons' life remains one of the most haunting aspects of his story. For the residents of the lodge, Cameron's presence was electrifying. She was both admired and feared, a woman who seemed to radiate danger as much as allure. Some believed she truly was the Scarlet Woman. Others saw her as a destructive force dragging Parsons further into ruin. But none could deny her impact. She transformed the atmosphere of the lodge, giving it a sense of purpose and inevitability that it had lacked before. The rituals no longer felt like experiments, they felt like destiny unfolding. In Cameron, Parsons saw not just a partner but the living embodiment of the goddess he had summoned. And whether she was truly divine or merely human, her role in his life sealed the path he would walk, a path that led inexorably toward fire, chaos, and destruction. By 1946, Jack Parsons was already a paradox made flesh, an engineer and chemist at the forefront of rocket science, and at the same time the high priest of an occult lodge. Nowhere was this paradox more visible than in the way he attempted to fuse his scientific work with his magical pursuits. To Parsons, these were not separate realms but different languages describing the same reality. Where his colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory saw chemistry and physics, Parsons saw alchemy and invocation. He mixed rocket fuel in daylight and drew magical sigils in candlelight, convinced that both acts tapped into the same universal energies. This conviction set him apart not only from his scientific peers but also from many occultists. He was building a bridge between the rational and the irrational, a bridge that might lead to transcendence or collapse. In the laboratories of Caltech and the desert testing grounds, Parsons was a visionary. His contributions to solid and liquid rocket fuels were revolutionary, making possible advances that would later propel the United States into the space age. He worked with explosives that terrified even seasoned chemists, handling them with the instinctive brilliance of someone who seemed born to command fire. The same reckless courage that allowed him to pour volatile chemicals into experimental engines also drove him to plunge into forbidden rituals. The laboratory and the temple were reflections of one another. In both, he pushed limits, courting disaster in the hope of revelation. To his mind, the thrust of a rocket breaking gravity's hold was not so different from the force of will breaking through the barriers of reality. Both were acts of liberation, fueled by knowledge and daring. Yet while his colleagues saw science as a path to order, Parsons embraced chaos. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, his brilliance was undeniable, but his personal life and occult activities made him increasingly suspect. Stories circulated of his strange beliefs and midnight ceremonies, and whispers reached the ears of military officials who relied on his work. In the tense atmosphere of the early Cold War, eccentricity could easily be mistaken for subversion. Parsons' association with known occultists and radicals raised red flags, and eventually his security clearances were revoked. For the scientific establishment, his occult life undermined his credibility. For Parsons, however, the rejection only deepened his conviction that science alone was insufficient. If the establishment would not accept his vision, then he would pursue it outside their walls, fusing his rocket genius with his magical ambitions. The fusion of science and sorcery in Parsons' worldview was not mere metaphor. He truly believed that the principles of physics and chemistry could be extended into the spiritual realm. Where ancient alchemists had sought to turn lead into gold, Parsons sought to turn will into reality, to engineer magical outcomes as deliberately as he engineered rocket engines. He wrote extensively about this fusion, describing magic as a form of applied psychology and physics, a way of manipulating forces through concentrated intention. For him, rituals were experiments, subject to trial and error, refinement, and innovation. Just as he tested fuels in controlled explosions, he tested invocations in carefully structured ceremonies. In both, failure was common, but failure was part of the process. Each explosion, whether of chemicals or of consciousness, taught him something new. This approach fascinated some and horrified others. To fellow occultists, Parsons' scientific background lent his rituals a credibility that few could match. He was not simply invoking gods with blind faith, he was experimenting with measurable energy. To his scientific peers, however, his occultism made him a liability. How could a man who spoke of summoning goddesses and elemental spirits also be trusted with classified military research? The contradiction was too great. Yet Parsons thrived on this very contradiction. He relished being both scientist and sorcerer, seeing in himself the prototype of a new kind of human, one unbound by the artificial divide between material and spiritual, reason and passion, science and magic. The rituals he performed with Marjorie Cameron reflected this fusion. Their sex magic operations were framed not only in mystical terms but also in scientific language. Parsons described them as processes of energy exchange, as engines of will designed to produce tangible results. The orgasm, he believed, released a burst of psychic energy comparable to a rocket's ignition, propelling intention into the cosmos. In his writings, he likened the forces of the universe to currents that could be harnessed, whether through equations or through incantations. The human body itself, he argued, was a machine of energy, capable of directing cosmic forces if properly attuned. For Parsons, the fusion of rocket science and ritual sex was not contradiction but completion. One fed the other, each confirming his belief that boundaries existed only to be broken. The psychological toll of this dual life, however, was immense. Parsons' colleagues grew wary of his increasingly erratic behavior, while his followers at the lodge became unsettled by the intensity of his scientific mystical experiments. Some saw him as a visionary who might unlock new dimensions of existence. Others feared he was courting disaster, mixing volatile chemicals in the lab by day and volatile forces in ritual by night. The potential for catastrophe seemed constant. A single mistake in the lab could ignite an explosion. A single misstep in ritual, Parsons warned, could unleash spiritual forces beyond control. He lived perpetually on the edge of destruction, sustained by the conviction that only through such risk could true breakthroughs occur. California itself provided the perfect stage for this fusion. In the desert, rockets roared against the silence, while in Pasadena mansions, chants echoed against the night. Both environments reflected the frontier spirit of the era, the belief that nothing was beyond reach, whether in the stars or in the hidden realms of spirit. Parsons embodied that spirit in its most extreme form, pushing beyond the boundaries of science and sanity alike. He became a symbol of the age's paradox, a man who helped lay the foundations of space exploration while simultaneously believing he had conjured a goddess from the astral plane. To his admirers, this made him a visionary. To his critics, it made him a madman. By 1946, the tension between these two worlds, rocketry and ritual, was reaching a breaking point. His scientific career was collapsing under the weight of suspicion and scandal, while his magical pursuits consumed him more completely than ever. Yet Parsons refused to choose between them. To him, there was no choice to be made. Science and sorcery were two sides of the same coin, both tools for the same purpose, to break through the limitations of the human condition. Whether through engines or invocations, he sought the same thing: to ascend, to transcend, to touch the infinite. The tragedy was that in pursuing both with equal fervor, he risked losing everything. For those who knew him, Parsons' dual identity was both inspiring and terrifying. He was the man who could build rockets that shook the earth, and the man who could command a room in ritual, his voice rising in incantation as if he spoke with the authority of gods. But genius and madness are often separated by the thinnest of lines, and by 1946, Parsons was walking that line more precariously than ever. The lodge had become a laboratory as much as his test sites had, and in both places, fire threatened to consume him. Whether the flames came from rocket fuel or ritual candles, the result was the same. Jack Parsons lived and burned in pursuit of powers that few dared even to imagine. By 1946, the world Jack Parsons had so recklessly built began to unravel. What had once seemed like a grand alchemical experiment, fusing science, sorcery, and destiny, now spiraled into betrayal, paranoia, and collapse. His rituals had summoned a scarlet woman, his rocket work had touched the stars, and his charisma had drawn followers into his orbit. But those same forces also drew vultures. Friends became rivals, lovers became traitors, and the lodge itself, once a crucible of forbidden energy, degenerated into a breeding ground for jealousy, suspicion, and ruin. The downfall of Jack Parsons did not come all at once. It arrived in a cascade of betrayals that left him isolated, stripped of resources, and haunted by the very forces he had called upon. The most devastating betrayal came from L. Ron Hubbard. Parsons had seen in Hubbard not only a friend but a fellow magician, a partner in the Babylon working. Together, they had called down visions, recorded voices from the beyond, and sought to summon the elemental goddess. Parsons trusted Hubbard deeply, ignoring Crowley's repeated warnings that the young science fiction writer was a con man. That trust proved catastrophic. Hubbard grew close to Sarah Northrup, Parsons' lover and magical partner, and the two conspired to swindle Parsons out of a large sum of money. They proposed a joint business venture in which Parsons invested heavily, only for Hubbard and Sarah to disappear with the funds. It was the kind of betrayal that seemed almost theatrical, an echo of Crowley's sardonic prophecy that Hubbard was not a magician but a fraud. To Parsons, however, it was more than a financial loss. It was a magical catastrophe. The man with whom he had shared his most sacred invocations had violated him in the most personal way, stealing not only his lover but his trust in the very fabric of destiny. The betrayal by Hubbard and Sarah marked a turning point. Parsons, once so confident in his visions, now teetered on the edge of despair. He pursued legal action against Hubbard, and though he recovered some money, the damage was done. His Scarlet Woman had fled, his magical partner had betrayed him, and the lodge was fractured by gossip and recrimination. Members whispered that the gods themselves had turned against Parsons, that his rituals had gone too far, unleashing chaos instead of control. Some began to leave, disillusioned by the paranoia and instability that now gripped the house. What had once been a place of daring experimentation now felt like a collapsing stage, its actors stumbling in the ruins of a drama that had lost its script. The paranoia spread beyond the walls of the lodge. Government agencies had already begun to take interest in Parsons' activities, and the Cold War atmosphere of suspicion only amplified their scrutiny. His associations with radicals, his occult practices, and his increasingly erratic behavior marked him as a liability. Security clearances were revoked. Military contracts dried up. The man who had once been a pioneer of rocketry was now cast out from the very world he had helped create. To his colleagues, he was no longer a visionary but an embarrassment, a dangerous eccentric whose name they preferred not to mention. For Parsons, the rejection was another betrayal, this time by the scientific establishment he had served so passionately. Stripped of professional standing, he retreated further into ritual, convinced that if the world of science had abandoned him, the gods might still offer salvation. Inside the lodge, the atmosphere grew increasingly toxic. Parsons' relationship with Marjorie Cameron was as volatile as it was consuming. She had become both his muse and his torment, the Scarlet Woman he believed he had summoned and the source of constant conflict. Their passion burned brightly but often erupted into fury and despair. Friends described nights of ecstatic ritual followed by mornings of violent arguments. Cameron herself was prone to visions and outbursts, and Parsons, already unstable, mirrored her volatility. Together, they fueled each other's descent into obsession. What Parsons saw as divine destiny, others saw as madness. The lodge, once electrified by possibility, now trembled under the weight of their unraveling union. The wider occult world also turned against Parsons. Crowley, reading reports of the Pasadena Lodge, grew increasingly scornful. He mocked Parsons' gullibility in trusting Hubbard, deriding him as a fool unworthy of true leadership. In letters, he dismissed Parsons' rituals as the antics of amateurs, warning that they threatened to discredit Thelema itself. For Parsons, the words of his master were a dagger. He had sought to impress Crowley, to prove himself the prophet of a new age, but now he was cast aside, ridiculed by the very figure he revered. The rejection left him spiritually adrift, caught between his devotion to Thelema and his resentment of the man who had given it shape. The betrayal by Crowley was not financial, like Hubbard's, but existential. It cut at the core of Parsons' identity, leaving him to wonder whether his life's work had been nothing more than folly. The paranoia deepened as external pressures mounted. Government agents questioned him about his associations, neighbors whispered about the strange activities in his home, and former allies spread rumors of his instability. Parsons began to see himself as the target of conspiracies, convinced that forces both earthly and supernatural were arrayed against him. He feared surveillance, betrayal, and spiritual attack. His writings from this period reveal a man unraveling, clinging to visions of destiny even as the walls of reality closed in. He spoke of cosmic forces struggling for control of his life, of enemies visible and invisible. The once bold visionary who had dared to summon gods now seemed trapped in a labyrinth of paranoia, unable to find his way back to the clarity of his early ambitions. Yet even in this collapse, there was fire. Parsons continued to write, to perform rituals, to dream of new beginnings. He clung to the belief that his destiny was not yet fulfilled, that the goddess he had summoned still guided him. He sought new opportunities, even as old ones crumbled. He imagined founding new lodges, writing new manifestos, and reclaiming his place as a prophet of both science and sorcery. But the betrayals had left scars that would not heal. His trust was shattered, his reputation ruined, his resources dwindling. The lodge that had once been a temple of possibility was now little more than a haunted house, echoing with the ghosts of failed dreams and broken vows. The collapse of Parsons' world in 1946 was not just the story of one man's downfall. It was the unraveling of a grand experiment, the implosion of an attempt to fuse science and magic, reason and passion, destiny and desire. Betrayed by his closest allies, rejected by his master, abandoned by the institutions he had helped build, Parsons stood alone at the crossroads of brilliance and madness. His life had become a cautionary tale even as it unfolded, a demonstration of how quickly genius could tip into ruin when unmoored by obsession. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Parsons refused to surrender. His story did not end with betrayal. It carried forward into fire, into one final act that would seal his legacy in both science and sorcery. But by the end of 1946, the man who had once seemed destined to touch the stars was already falling, consumed by the very forces he had unleashed. The end came not with a whimper, but with fire. On June 17, 1952, Jack Parsons was working in a makeshift laboratory in a carriage house in Pasadena. Surrounded by jars of volatile chemicals, experimental propellants, and the fragments of a career that had once promised him the stars, he was preparing for what should have been a routine task. At 37 years old, Parsons was a man worn down by betrayal, paranoia, and rejection, yet still clinging to the dream that he could reinvent himself. He had taken small contracts here and there, applying his expertise in rocketry to commercial projects, even considering opportunities abroad. But that day, instead of a new beginning, came the fiery conclusion of a life that had always courted disaster. An explosion ripped through the building, shattering windows, blasting debris into the street, and sending smoke billowing into the California sky. Inside, Parsons lay mortally wounded, his body broken, his face unrecognizable, his last moments consumed in the flames he had spent his life mastering. The official story was simple: an accident. Parsons had been handling fulminate of mercury, an extremely sensitive and unstable explosive compound, when it detonated unexpectedly. The force of the blast tore through the lab, collapsing walls and scattering shards of glass and metal. Neighbors rushed to the scene, horrified by the destruction. Parsons, still alive but grievously injured, was pulled from the wreckage. His right forearm was blown away, his leg shattered, his face mutilated. He was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. Within hours, Jack Parsons, rocket scientist, occultist, visionary, and heretic, was dead. The coroner listed the cause as an accidental explosion, a tragic but unsurprising end for a man who had spent his life courting risk. Yet from the beginning, the circumstances of his death raised questions. To many, it seemed too sudden, too symbolic, too perfectly in line with the myth of a man who had lived in fire. Rumors spread almost immediately. Some whispered that it had been suicide, that Parsons, worn down by years of failure and betrayal, had chosen to end his life in the most dramatic way possible, going out in an explosion, consumed by the same fire he had once bent to his will. Supporters rejected this, pointing out that Parsons had been making plans for the future. He was preparing to move to Mexico with Marjorie Cameron, where he hoped to restart his career away from the suspicions of the American government. He had even spoken excitedly about new projects and contracts. Suicide, they argued, did not fit. Others claimed sabotage. Parsons had enemies in both scientific and occult circles, and the Cold War climate made him a target of government scrutiny. Some speculated that intelligence agencies might have eliminated him to prevent his knowledge from falling into the hands of foreign powers. Still others believed that rivals in the occult world, or even forces he had invoked himself, had finally claimed their due. The most unsettling theory was that his death had been ritual, whether intentional or not. For years, Parsons had written about fire as both destructive and purifying, a force of transformation. In his magical worldview, fire was not merely physical combustion but a cosmic energy capable of consuming the old and giving birth to the new. Some of his writings even seemed to foreshadow his own death, hinting that he might be destroyed in flames as part of his destiny. To those who viewed him through the lens of myth, the explosion was not an accident but the inevitable consummation of his life's work. A man who had lived by fire, dying by fire, transformed into legend in the very element he revered. In this reading, the lab was less a workshop than a pyre, and Parsons' final act was less tragedy than ritual sacrifice. Cameron, devastated by his death, embraced this interpretation. She believed Parsons had fulfilled his role as a prophet of Babylon, that his death in fire was the consummation of his magical mission. In her grief, she interpreted his death as a form of alchemical transformation, the burning away of his mortal form to release his true essence. She would later describe visions of him after death, as if his spirit had not been destroyed but transfigured. For Cameron, Parsons' fiery end was not an accident but a sacred fulfillment. She took on the role of his widow, priestess, and carrier of his legacy, continuing to create art and perform rituals in his name. To her, the explosion was not the end of Parsons, it was his apotheosis. But outside the circles of myth and magic, the death of Jack Parsons was remembered more grimly. To his former colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, it was a sordid reminder of a man they had tried to forget. Once hailed as a pioneer, he was now dismissed as a cautionary tale, a brilliant chemist undone by recklessness and delusion. Newspapers seized on the sensational aspects of his story, labeling him a black magician and emphasizing the scandal of his occult activities. The accident was portrayed less as the tragic loss of a scientific mind and more as the inevitable end of a man who had strayed too far from reason. For mainstream society, Parsons' death confirmed what many had already suspected, that he was not a visionary but a madman, destroyed by his own dangerous obsessions. The ambiguity of Parsons' death has never been resolved. Was it truly an accident, the result of carelessness with dangerous chemicals? Was it suicide, a final gesture of despair and drama? Was it sabotage, the silencing of a man who knew too much? Or was it, in some sense, the fulfillment of a destiny he had written for himself? Each interpretation reflects a different aspect of his life: the scientist undone by risk, the occultist consumed by ritual, the visionary betrayed by enemies, the martyr of his own myth. Perhaps the truth lies in the convergence of all these possibilities, for Parsons' life was never a single story but a collision of contradictions. His death, fiery and violent, was the only ending that could encompass them all. What remains most haunting is the symbolism. Parsons, the man who helped ignite humanity's journey to the stars, ended in an explosion not on a launch pad but in a crumbling garage. His fire did not lift a rocket into the sky but consumed his own body. The irony is cruel, but it is also fitting. Parsons had always blurred the line between triumph and disaster, between creation and destruction. In death, as in life, he embodied both. The explosion in Pasadena was not just the end of a man but the ignition of a myth, one that continues to burn in the imaginations of those drawn to the strange crossroads of science and sorcery. In the aftermath, Cameron carried his memory like a torch, while others buried his name in silence. The house was cleared, the wreckage removed, and the city moved on. Yet the echo of the blast lingered, a reminder of a man who had dared too much, risked too far, and paid the ultimate price. Jack Parsons' fiery death was the last act in a life that had always been theatrical, dramatic, and dangerous. Whether it was accident, suicide, sabotage, or sacrifice, it sealed his place as one of the most enigmatic figures of the 20th century. He was the rocket scientist who played with demons, the magician who reached for the stars, the man who burned with visions until he finally burned himself away. Jack Parsons' death did not extinguish his influence. If anything, it amplified it. What remained of him after the fire was not simply a broken body but a fractured legacy, part science, part sorcery, part myth. He became, in the decades after 1952, a figure both celebrated and reviled, the forgotten father of the American space program, the eccentric occultist who tried to summon a goddess, and the cautionary tale of a man consumed by obsession. His life and death were too strange to be confined to one narrative, and so he became many things at once: a visionary in the annals of rocketry, a prophet in the eyes of occultists, a scandal in the newspapers, and a ghost in the culture of California shadowlands. His legacy is not one of resolution but of contradiction, a fire that continues to burn in both light and darkness. In the world of science, Parsons' contributions to rocketry are undeniable. His work on solid rocket fuels and propulsion systems laid the groundwork for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a cornerstone of NASA's future achievements. Without his daring experiments, the American space program might have lagged behind its rivals. The very engines that carried satellites into orbit and astronauts to the moon owe something to Parsons' volatile genius. Yet for decades, his name was quietly erased from official histories. Colleagues and institutions downplayed or ignored his role, embarrassed by the scandal of his occult activities. To celebrate Parsons meant acknowledging the strange rituals in his Pasadena mansion, the sex magic, the invocations of demons and goddesses. In an age when the Cold War demanded discipline, patriotism, and rationality, Parsons was too dangerous a figure to enshrine as a hero. Thus, in the halls of science, he became a ghost, essential but unacknowledged, his flame hidden beneath layers of silence. In the world of occultism, however, Parsons' name burned brightly. His writings, especially the Book of Babylon and his notes on the Babylon working, became touchstones for later generations of Thelemites and esoteric seekers. To them, Parsons was not a reckless amateur but a visionary who had dared to push Crowley's teachings further than anyone else. Where Crowley had proclaimed the coming of the Aeon of Horus, Parsons had sought to incarnate its goddess, Babylon, in the flesh. His life was seen as a magical act, his death as a sacrifice, his legacy as proof that magic could shape reality as powerfully as science. Marjorie Cameron, who survived him, became his priestess in death, interpreting his life as a prophecy fulfilled and carrying his image into her art and rituals. To occultists, Parsons was a martyr of the New Age, a man destroyed not by failure but by the magnitude of his vision. Beyond science and magic, Parsons' legacy seeped into culture in strange ways. The 1960s counterculture, with its embrace of mysticism, free love, and cosmic exploration, echoed many of the themes Parsons had lived decades earlier. His blending of science and spirituality, rockets, and rituals seemed to foreshadow the psychedelic age, when hippies, artists, and seekers sought to break through reality's limits by any means possible. Cameron herself became a figure in this counterculture, befriending artists, poets, and musicians, and preserving Parsons' memory as both muse and martyr. To those who experimented with LSD, communes, and alternative spirituality, Parsons appeared as a precursor, a man who had walked the path they were only beginning to tread, even if his fire had consumed him. Even in mainstream culture, Parsons' story proved irresistible. Novelists, filmmakers, and journalists returned to his life again and again, drawn by the paradox of the rocket scientist who summoned demons. He appeared in biographies of Crowley, in exposés of Scientology, in histories of the space race. His name resurfaced whenever the hidden connections between science, mysticism, and madness were explored. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the tragic genius, the reckless occultist, the betrayed lover, the doomed prophet. No single narrative could contain him, and so his legend fractured into countless versions, each reflecting the fears and fascinations of its era. To some, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing science with superstition. To others, he was a visionary whose daring pointed the way to a future beyond conventional limits. The duality of his legacy is perhaps best captured in the way institutions treated him after his death. For decades, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory avoided mentioning him, erasing his role from its official history. Yet among occult circles, his reputation grew, his name whispered as one of the most powerful magicians of the 20th century. And every whisper of occult ritual in California's deserts, every invocation of Babylon, carries his shadow as well. His fire burned into both the material and the spiritual worlds, leaving marks that cannot be erased. Jack Parsons' legacy, then, is neither purely triumphant nor purely tragic. It is a legacy of fire and shadow, of genius and ruin. He remains a figure who resists simplification, who forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that the line between science and sorcery, between creation and destruction, is thinner than we would like to believe. His name may not be carved in the monuments of NASA, but it lingers in the hidden corners of history, where myths and truths intermingle. Jack Parsons is remembered not only as the man who helped launch humanity toward the stars, but also as the man who dared to summon gods from the abyss. In that duality lies his true legacy, a life that burned too brightly, leaving behind both light and darkness, brilliance and ash. The story of Jack Parsons closes like a grim parable, a tale as old as Faust yet told in the strange vocabulary of the 20th century: rockets, rituals, and the desperate pursuit of transcendence. In the end, his life forces us to confront the question of what happens when human ambition crosses every boundary, when the hunger for knowledge and power leaves no room for restraint. Parsons was, in so many ways, the embodiment of that hunger. He was the boy abandoned by his father, the dreamer obsessed with fire and flight, the scientist who carved the path to the stars, and the occultist who dared to summon gods. His life was a story of daring, brilliance, and relentless obsession, and his death was the inevitable ignition of all those forces combusting at once. What remains is not just a biography, but a warning, a riddle, and a haunting echo that reverberates through history. When we step back from the details of his life, the Pasadena Lodge, the Babylon working, the betrayal by Hubbard, the fiery death in his laboratory, we see a pattern that feels archetypal. Parsons was a man who sought the infinite in every direction. Science was not enough. Religion was not enough. Love was not enough. He wanted all of it at once, to build machines that would pierce the heavens, to conduct rituals that would pierce the veil of reality, to live a life of passion that would burn away all constraint. He was, in essence, a magician in both the laboratory and the temple, convinced that human will could reshape the universe itself. This conviction was both his genius and his doom. Like Faust, he struck a bargain, not with a single demon, but with the abyss itself. And like Faust, the bargain consumed him. His story resonates because it mirrors the contradictions of the modern world. The 20th century was an age of miracles and nightmares. It gave us space travel, antibiotics, and the digital revolution, but it also gave us atomic bombs, world wars, and mass destruction. Parsons lived at the heart of that contradiction, embodying both its brilliance and its madness. He helped ignite the rockets that would carry humanity beyond Earth, yet he also sought to invoke spirits that most would dismiss as superstition. He was a visionary who refused to separate reason from magic, progress from danger. In this sense, his life forces us to ask unsettling questions. How far should we go in pursuit of knowledge? What happens when ambition erases the line between genius and hubris? Is the human will a tool of liberation, or a force of destruction? Parsons' death, fiery and violent, becomes a symbol for these questions. It is tempting to see it as an accident, a tragic end to a reckless man. But when we place it within the myth he created for himself, it takes on deeper meaning. He had always written about fire as both creation and destruction, about the need to burn away the old to bring forth the new. His explosion was not just the end of his body but the consummation of his myth. He died as he lived, in fire, chaos, and intensity. Whether accident, suicide, sabotage, or sacrifice, the flames that consumed him sealed his story in the language of myth. He became the rocket scientist who burned himself away, the occultist who may have called down forces too great to control, the prophet who paid the price of daring too much. Yet to reduce Parsons' story to tragedy alone would be to miss its complexity. His legacy lives on, in both the rockets that still thunder skyward and the occult traditions that still invoke his name. Every launch that breaks Earth's gravity carries within it a spark of Parsons' genius, the intuition that fuels could be shaped to defy the impossible. And in the shadows of occult circles, his writings continue to inspire those who seek liberation through transgression, who believe that the human will can summon gods as surely as it can build machines. He lingers in both worlds, a ghost who refuses to be confined. His life, in this sense, was not wasted. It was transmuted, like lead into fire, into something that continues to ignite imaginations decades after his death. But the fascination with Parsons also reveals something about us. We are drawn to his story not only because it is bizarre, but because it reflects our own anxieties. We live in a world shaped by science and haunted by its consequences. We trust in progress, yet fear its cost. We pursue technology to transcend our limits, yet wonder whether we are summoning forces we cannot control. Parsons' life becomes a metaphor for this tension. He is both warning and inspiration, both monster and martyr. He shows us what happens when the boundaries collapse, when reason and madness embrace, when the desire for transcendence becomes absolute. His story unsettles us because it feels so familiar. We recognize in him the extremes of our own age, stretched to their breaking point. Marjorie Cameron's devotion after his death ensures that his story retains its mystical dimension. She saw in him not just a man, but a prophet who had fulfilled his destiny. To her, his fiery death was a ritual sacrifice, the culmination of his mission to bring forth Babylon and usher in a new age. Whether one believes this or not, her interpretation highlights the mythic quality of his life. Parsons refused to live as an ordinary man, and in death he refused to become one. He was elevated into symbol, into archetype, into legend. Even if the institutions of science tried to erase him, and even if the newspapers mocked him as a mad magician, the myth endured. Today, his name circulates in books, films, and whispered stories, always carrying the same paradox: genius and madness, creation and destruction, light and shadow. The Faustian bargain at the heart of Parsons' life remains unresolved. Did he sell his soul to the abyss, or did he simply live with such intensity that his soul was consumed by fire? Was he a visionary destroyed by betrayal, or a reckless man undone by his own hubris? The answers shift depending on how one views him, and perhaps that is the point. Parsons resists resolution. He is meant to disturb, to unsettle, to haunt. He forces us to acknowledge that the pursuit of transcendence is never safe, that fire always burns, that brilliance and destruction are often the same flame. His life warns us that those who would touch the infinite may be consumed by it, but it also whispers that without such daring, humanity might never reach the stars. As the curtain falls on Parsons' story, what remains is the image of fire. Fire in the engines that broke the Earth's pull. Fire in the candles that lit his rituals. Fire in the explosion that ended his life. Fire as symbol of both creation and destruction, liberation and damnation. Jack Parsons lived and died in fire, and his legacy is the flame that refuses to be extinguished. He reminds us that every step toward the heavens casts a shadow, that every act of creation carries within it the seed of ruin, and that those who dare to summon gods must be prepared to face demons as well. He was the rocket scientist who dared to summon the abyss, and in that daring, he became both warning and inspiration. His bargain with the stars was a Faustian one, and though it consumed him, it left behind a fire that still burns, brilliant, dangerous, and unforgettable.